SAT School Day this spring of 2026. Thank you for joining us this afternoon as we take a deep dive into the process of preparing for and requesting accommodations for the Connecticut SAT School Day. My name is Deirdre Ducharme, and I work in the Performance Office at the Connecticut State Department of Education. I am pleased to be joined today by colleagues from the College Board who will help guide us through today's training. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce a few key members of our team. From the CSDE, we're joined by our Connecticut SAT School Day Program Manager, Michelle Rosado. Michelle, if you can wave, say hello to Michelle.
I'll just say hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and taking out time out of your really busy schedules. We appreciate it. And of course, I have to shout out to my Assistant Program Manager, Stella the Yorkie, who's in the middle of the slide. And Abe will not be joining us today, Deirdre.
Thank you, Michelle. And Abe does some his best. So in addition, I don't know if anyone else from the Performance Office is on this call. So if I've missed you, please accept my apologies. But I would also like to take a moment to introduce colleagues from the College Board. Already, if you signed on earlier, we're joined by Keisha Smith. She and I work closely together throughout the school year to ensure that your students receive the supports and accommodations that they need when taking the SAT. Keisha, please take a moment to introduce yourself and the team from College Board.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Keisha Smith. As Deirdre had mentioned, I am the Senior Director for SSD Customer Support. Again, Deirdre and I work very closely together throughout the year to make sure that we are providing accommodations and testing supports for students in preparation for SAT School Day. We have a couple of College Board members joining us today. First, I will say from the SSD office, joining me is Dr. Sasha Pimienta. Dr. Pimienta will assist Deirdre and team in the background regarding SSD questions. And we have a lot to cover today. So hopefully we will be targeting a lot of your concerns, if any, that you may have, but your curiosity about what's expected ahead in preparation for spring. I will pass the baton over to my colleague, Dominique Bernard.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dominique Bernard. I am the State Implementation Manager for Connecticut. Happy to be here with you all today. I will be going through a few of the slides with Keisha, just covering some SSD content along with some SAT School Day information that is important to the implementation. So great to be here. You guys will see me in the chat, and I'll kick it over to you, Jenny.
Hi, everybody. Jenny Cacavalli. I'm Director, State and District Partnerships. So hope you've probably gotten lots of emails from me. I'm the state lead for Connecticut. Nice to see everybody virtually on this.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Before we dive into the content, we would like to share a few quick housekeeping notes. A copy of today's presentation is included in your chat, so please take note of that. It is also going to be posted to the Connecticut SAT School Day webpage, and you can access this training along with other College Board trainings that we've offered so far this fall. Please share these slides with colleagues who were unable to attend or who may benefit from this content. We have a lot of information to cover today. Many of your questions will be covered throughout this presentation, but if you have additional questions, please use the chat feature and submit them. And if you have questions that are not covered by the end of this training, please use the contact information at the end of this presentation to either email me, College Board, or the Performance Office, and we will certainly follow up with additional information so that all of your needs are met. So thank you again for attending, and Keisha, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deirdre. So we're going to just do a brief overview of the agenda and a few other items before we transition into the update for spring, accessing SSD Online and covering accommodations. excuse me, from soup to nuts. And so Dominique will actually cover the next few slides, and then I will jump in, followed by my wonderful colleague Deirdre Ducharme, where we will cover some additional information specific to the CT SET system, for example, and how it relates to the process to get started with College Board systems as well. Dominique?
All right. So we'll review the agenda. We'll start with the testing window and the SSD deadlines for spring 2026. We'll take a look at some of the updates that are coming your way for spring 2026. We'll show you how to access SSD online, how to confirm your access if you are a returning coordinator, and how to establish access if you are a new SSD coordinator. We'll take a look at the types of accommodations and supports for College Board assessments. We'll show you how to review accommodations, previously approved accommodations, and then also how to submit any new accommodation or support requests. We'll take a look at some training and resources available to students, and then we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. As Deirdre mentioned, we will be covering a lot of information, so a lot of your questions will be answered. We do ask that you hold or try to hold your questions until the Q&A session. We want to make sure that we do have time. And like I said, a lot of the questions do get answered along the way. So pop your questions into the chat. Whatever we do not have time for, we will follow up with you, either in a Q&A doc or just follow up by email. The slide that you're seeing here is about student sharing personal identifiable information. And we just want to make sure that we're being careful and exercising caution when sharing this information. We shouldn't be sharing by email or in writing. If you do have a question or you need to discuss something that includes personally identifiable information, we ask that you contact us by phone. And any student PII, the information listed here includes some of the PII that you would take into account, which is name, date of birth, address, telephone number, email address, or any identifying numbers, such as an SSD number or like a state student ID. Please exercise caution when handling student PII and only use student SACID or SSD. If it becomes necessary, as I mentioned, just communicate via phone. Our number is listed in the contact information. It is 866-609-2205. Testing window and SSD deadlines. All right, these are some very important dates. Monday, March 2nd to Thursday, April 30th is your entire testing window. You will choose a smaller testing window for your school within that time frame, but we do want to make it clear that there is no makeup testing window, so all testing must be completed by April 30th. Now for your SSD deadlines, the open dates that you will see here for College Board approved assessments, it is open now. You can go in and submit those accommodations or check on the ones that are already in the system. And the close date is going to be January 12th, 2026. It is a little bit different for the EL and ML support requests. For up to time and 1/2, the portal is actually open right now, so you can go in and you can make those requests. The reason it says mid-December 2025 for the open date is because we do have some new accommodations that Keisha will be covering with you a little later in this presentation, but those are not available to be submitted until mid-December. So you will have from mid-December to January 12th, 2026 to submit the new accommodations that we'll take a look at. And she'll be mentioning, as you see here, text-to-speech for math only. So we'll dig a little bit deeper into what that is and what that looks like in the slides to come.
Thank you, Dominique. So as briefly mentioned, we are going to cover some new updates for spring. I will say overall, most of the accommodations and system processes from last year continue into this year. But there are a few updates, and some of you may be familiar with at least one of them if you've previously had students participate in the October fall testing. One second. So text-to-speech for math sections. This will be a new accommodation, a College Board approved accommodation that we will be offering. As Dominique had mentioned, this will launch in the spring. This actually provides audio support via the text-to-speech functionality, but only for the math sections. Students who are not identified, students who are identified for the text-to-speech for math section accommodation, they will not have exposure to utilizing text-to-speech for the reading, writing sections to include audio support. And we'll talk about it in a moment a little deeper, but we definitely wanted to cover here because it is something new. It will, for this particular College Board accommodation, as with all, an IEP or 504 would be where that information would be identified that the student specifically would utilize text-to-speech for math. Text-to-speech, again, for those of you who are familiar, we did launch that for digital testing where we have that accommodation previously in place, and it will continue. That applies to the entire test. So that is slightly different. Again, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but this is just covering some of the most important information that you need to know. As I mentioned, IEP or 504, in order for it to be identified for a College Board approved accommodation. You will not see this specific accommodation identified in SSD Online today because it does not launch until mid-December. Like all College Board approved accommodations, when those accommodations are in place, it is not just specific to SAT School Day, but for any of your students that may require this specific accommodation, it will be available for the upcoming spring SAT Connecticut sponsored school day. College Board approved accommodation applies to other assessments. So we won't dive into those today because we are focused on SAT School Day, but it is important for you to understand the difference. And what also is a continuing theme is that College Board approved accommodations will always be college reportable. Some of you may be saying, well, text-to-speech, we may refer to it as screen reader. Certain schools, this type of language may be interchangeable. So it is important that we do also point out here that we will also have a screen reader accommodation for math sections only, which will launch as well in December. Screen reader, for those of you who are more familiar with it, it is slightly different. They both provide audio support, text-to-speech and screen reader. But screen reader, we often find would be commonly used more for students with visual impairments. And in those cases, those students would likely need to utilize it for the entire test. And so with all accommodations, we always say it's on an individual case-by-case basis. So while we do offer this accommodation, we do say that best practice would be if you know you have students that require read aloud audio for the entire test, that you use the accommodations we currently have today, which is text-to-speech for the entire test, which is embedded in the Blue Book app, and we'll cover it a little deeper shortly, or for your visually impaired student who needs everything read from end to end of that page, screen reader for the entire test would be more appropriate. But again, this is just to give you an introduction. We have a lot of information to cover today, so I will move forward. EL text-to-speech for math sections. So as Dominique had showed when she gave the overview of the deadlines, we currently offer EL text-to-speech 50%, and then we have 2 additional non-embedded supports that we'll talk about later. But we are also launching for EL students, EL text-to-speech for math. This will be specific for your students who are identified as EL/ML students, where they are receiving the audio again for the math section, but they will need to meet the EL/ML criteria per the Connecticut policies in order for this type of support to be provided for the student. But just like what I previously explained in terms of the functionality and how the student will utilize text-to-speech for math, it remains the same. It will only be for the math sections of the test. So this would be students who utilize that text-to-speech for their math work. Available again, starting in December, mid-December, for you to access. But for English learners, you're going to go through the EL portal, and we'll talk about that a little later. But your EL/ML students will be identified in PSIS as having that requirement for language support. So that's how they would meet that eligibility. Deirdre, did you want to speak to anything about PSIS?
Thank you so much for that overview, Keisha. I would just recommend that our school counselors and coordinators verify the student demographics in PSIS to make sure that the students do have the correct demographic set. So we already have the student data, the updated demographics from Free0 in our TIDE system, which is separate from SSD. But if you are planning for EL supports and accommodations for your students on the SAT school day, just make sure that those students are identified as EL, ML, and PSIS. Thank you.
Thanks, Deirdre. Jumping ahead, we've already covered that it will be available through the EL portal or the request flow in SSD Online mid-December. But unlike the College Board approved accommodation, EL supports are only specific to certain College Board assessments, and that is for the SAT suite of assessments. So that applies to SAT school day for spring, also for PSAT 10, which typically happens in spring, and PSAT 8-9, as well as PSAT NMSQT. And I'll make sure this information gets updated properly to include NMSQT. But just like what we mentioned before in terms of college reportable, EL supports are college reportable. It is not offered as a temporary support. Some of you may be wondering what are temporary supports. We will touch on it a little later, but it is typically where a student has experienced an injury, where possibly maybe they're unable to write, or they experienced a concussion and needed to maybe have some additional time. So we offer that specifically for spring school day participation, and we'll talk about it a little later, but I wanted to mention it in case it is something new for the audience that may be joining as new SSD coordinators. Both of these accommodations, all College Board accommodations that are embedded in the system, will be displayed in the Blue Book testing platform, and those accommodations will be confirmed in Test Day Toolkit. So the SSD coordinator role. It is extremely important for those who are acting in this role as the SSD coordinator. You're submitting your information for College Board approved accommodations and English learner ML supports through this system. You must have access to the SSD online system in order to do this. And it's important even more so because in order for us to guarantee that your students will be able to start testing with their accommodations and or supports at the beginning of your window, for example, if you're testing during week 1, we ask that you try to meet as much as possible the January 12th deadline. With EL support, yes, it's slightly different, and we will cover that. And we do have scenarios. We understand you may have new students to your school, so maybe you were unable to meet that January 12th deadline. We will always make sure that we support those scenarios, and those students can test later in the window. But putting your kids in as early as possible would make it, I believe, less stressful for you as you are approaching a busy testing season, in addition to the very important work that you already do as educators. As an SSD coordinator, you are having that ongoing communication with students and families about their testing accommodations, whether it's a brand new IEP or 504, if you're making a change to the accommodations on the plans, and if this is a student who's already identified in SSD Online and you need to make those changes, this is why that ongoing communication with the families are extremely important. You're reviewing those accommodations. Again, as I mentioned, if you have students that were previously approved, and we'll talk about some best practices, how to support that as early as possible. You're assisting your testing coordinator who will need to help identify which rooms your accommodated students are being put in, such as your 50 and 100%. You may have students that require a one-to-one room, depending on their specific type of accommodation. And in addition to that, you're also doing a lot of collaboration with your technology coordinator to make sure that student devices are configured to support assistive technology as needed. So you did hear me mention before, text-to-speech is embedded. That's automatically put into the Blue Book platform. You do not need to do any test configuration. But when we think about the other read aloud accommodation, screen reader needs to be configured through, because you're utilizing a third-party operating device, reader device such as JAWS, for example. So those are just things that you want to make sure you are planning ahead as early as possible, and of course practice. And we talk about practicing throughout today's session because it's extremely important to make sure your students are prepared for test day. And then again, just reiterating, you are partnering throughout this process with that test coordinator in the process of the administering of those assessments for your students testing with accommodations. Accessing SSD Online. So in order to get into the SSD system, again, you will need to be established as an SSD coordinator. You will also need to make sure that you establish your College Board Educator account. So you actually will need this first before you can request for SSD access. And the other thing about the College Board Educator account, if you are brand new to being an SSD coordinator this year, is that the College Board account is what connects you to all of the other associated tools that you will need to be identified with. So if you need access to Test Day Toolkit, if you need access to the State Data Management System, this is like the main source where those links will exist. So you will need to have your information established as a College Board educator in order to access these various tools. As I mentioned, yes, in order to be an SSD coordinator, you will need to be established in our system, right? College Board educator account is the first step in order to do the setup, but because you will need this for other College Board tools, in addition to SSD Online. But in order to establish yourself as an SSD coordinator, you will need to use our online web form system. And I'm so happy when I say that. You can't see me smiling because this used to be a paper-based system, and now we are a web form. So I am very appreciative to our tech teams that have heard the concerns that we often receive from educators about the cumbersome and antiquated paper process. So when you are establishing yourself, you will need to identify yourself as either a primary or an additional user. And what are the differences? Each school must have one primary SSD coordinator, so there can only be one primary. However, if you have a school with a much larger volume of students, we do ask that you consider early adding a couple of additional staff that are typically working with students regarding their support, such as your guidance counselors or anything, and having access to IEP 504 information, to have those folks also set themselves up with SSD user access. Again, it will help you along the way when you have a larger volume of students to put in, whether you're putting in College Board approved accommodations for IEP 504 students or your students. ELML students. The typical processing time frame in order to establish this information, as far as getting the notification that you are verified and confirmed in the system, it typically takes about 3 to 5 days. In much lower volume times, it can happen sooner. So if you're able to start doing this now, we do ask that you do it as early as possible, because it's a very easy process. And so what is SSD Online if you're brand new? So SSD Online is our College Board accommodations management system. This system will allow you to have access to request accommodations for your students. You're able to track the status of their accommodations, and you're also able to see information in the system about all of the students that are identified under your school's AI code, all in one place. As you see, I have here, you'll see in bold, it says print dashboard. This is a very good tool to use when you do have a much larger volume of students. And remember what I said earlier about collaborating with the test coordinator. So this is a good way because you're able to export the information from the print dashboard feature. It will show you your list of students. You can, manipulate it to your liking. It will be a CSV file, and it will identify for you all of your students' names, their accommodation for Test Day Toolkit. Are you still hearing me, Deirdre?
Yes, although you did cut out a little bit, but we're
Okay,
glad you're back.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry about that. What I was just mentioning was about the collaboration with the print dashboard feature. When you print that information off, it will allow you to see your full list of students with their accommodations. So that will help with the collaborating with the test coordinator, who will have the access to the students and accommodations that they're approved for in TDTK. If you are a returning SSD coordinator, it's just very important as early as possible, if you have not already done so, to confirm your access. And this is just a quick step-by-step of how you would go through retrieving your information. I'm going to pause right here to pass the baton over to Dominique to talk about how College Board systems work together.
All right, thanks, Keisha. As Keisha mentioned, we're going to review how College Board systems work together. We'll take a look at Blue Book, Test Day Toolkit, the State Data Management System, and SSD Online. So here you'll see the landing pages for a few of the systems, starting with Blue Book. Blue Book is the system that students are going to use for testing. They'll use it on test day, but it is available for practice right now. Actually, students can log in and practice and prepare for the SAT. Next, you'll see the Test Day Toolkit, which is used by test coordinators and proctors. So test coordinators will use Test Day Toolkit to start preparing for testing, getting the rooms together, assigning staff to rooms, making sure all of the staff is loaded into Test Day Toolkit, and proctors do use it on test day to administer the test. The State Data Management System is for registration management. We'll go over it a little bit more in another slide, but it's pretty much where you would go to view all of the student registration data, verify and confirm the information. And I believe the very next slide if you want to go to it, Keisha, we have a breakdown here. So this is the way that all of our systems work together. We'll start at the very beginning. You'll see in red that CSDE submits the registration data from PSIS to SDMS. So the information comes from the team at CSDE along with the accommodations data that is submitted in SSD Online. That information flows into the state data management system. And here you can review the student registration and accommodations data. If anything is incorrect or needs to be fixed, you would either contact CSDE for student registration, or you would need to contact SSD Online to correct any information that is incorrect regarding student accommodations. You can force match and waive accommodations in the state data management system. With waiving accommodations, you do want to make sure that you have spoken with the student and the parent. They are in agreement if the student is younger than 18. The waiving of accommodations does not affect other tests, so it would only be for the SAT school day. And it is just giving the student the opportunity to take back tests without using that specific accommodation. You can view student testing status at the school district or state level, depending on the role. And force matching and waiving also depends on your role. And if there are any issues, like I mentioned, you would contact your district's PSIS coordinator if there are inaccuracies in SDMS regarding registration. The information from State Data Management System does flow into Test State Toolkit and Blue Book. So we'll want to make sure all of that information is correct. We cannot make any changes in Test State Toolkit itself or Blue Book itself. We have to make sure the information is correct in the State Data Management System. Once the information is loaded or any updates are made, that information does take a full business day to flow into Test State Toolkit and Blue Book. And Test State Toolkit is going to be used, as I mentioned, by staff. So test coordinators and proctors using it to prepare for testing, and then proctors are going to use it to administer the test. You'll also use Test State Toolkit to submit any irregularity reports. Blue Book is used for students to test on test day and practice. The information that flows from SDMS to Blue Book is going to create that student's unique test package. So as I mentioned, we want to make sure everything is correct. We do have multiple opportunities to confirm the information. So test coordinators are going to have a chance to review and correct any information before it flows into Blue Book. But then students do have the chance to view the information and make sure it's correct and report it if it is not. To the proctor, which in turn lets the test coordinator know so that we can make the updates. So we want to make sure that everything is correct in advance, as soon as possible, so that by the time it gets to the student, we are good to go. All right, Keisha. All right, it looks like, Keisha, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm just trying to be mindful that looks like the service had dropped out. Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to actually jump in for the next few slides, just so we can reorient ourselves with where the accommodations should be documented for the purposes of the Connecticut SAT school day. So I really appreciate all of the important content that both Keisha and Dominique have shared thus far, and how important it is that accommodation data is correct from the very source. So I'd like to take a moment to reference you to the Connecticut Special Education Data System, CTSEDS, and that is the online system used by our planning and placement teams and our Section 504 teams for identifying, planning, documenting students' goals, objectives, supports to access instruction, and a number of other critical parts, the components of the student's individualized education profile. So CTSEDS is the source for documenting accommodations for the Connecticut SAT school day. it is separate from the College Board's SSD online. So just to kind of flesh out how the two operate, even though they're not interconnected at this point. So as the very foundation, a student's accommodation must be identified in CT SEDS for their current grade. And the accommodations are valid once the plan is finalized and implemented. So we're talking about Section 504 plans and IEPs. Now, unlike our Next Generation Science Standards Assessment and Smarter Balance, there is no sync between CT SEDS and the SSD Online. So you want to make sure that you generate a report from SSD Online that identifies the accommodation, the students that who are approved for accommodations in SSD. You want to know who those kids are, what those accommodations are, and then align that with the report that can be generated by your CT SEDS data manager. And that will, you can compare the reports to identify if there are any new updates to a student's IEP or Section 504 plan in relation to the accommodations that they're eligible for. And that will be a cue as to whether you need to go back into SSD Online and remove an accommodation, maybe add an accommodation. And as Keisha had mentioned earlier, College Board is offering a new accommodation option for kids that are eligible for text-to-speech. We recommend that if students require text-to-speech as an accommodation, they should be receiving it for the entire assessment. However, if you have a student that may only need it for math, please know that when you log on to CT SEDS, the accommodation menu for the Connecticut SAT school day does reflect those new additions for accommodations. And we have worked with PCG to represent updated accommodations in CT SEDS for grade 11 so that there's a closer alignment with the College Board accommodations in SSD. So the takeaway message here is please review the accommodations carefully in SSD Online. Please review them carefully in CT SEDS and make sure that the students' accommodations are correctly reflected in SSD for the purposes of this current school year and accommodations that the student needs for the grade 11 Connecticut SAT school day. And then just to reiterate, there is no syncing between the two systems at this point in time. We are hoping to offer an automation process, kind of like what we have with the TIDE system, but that is something that will not be in effect for another year or two. So if you move on to the next slide, I just want to, again, orient you to how the documents are where they're located in CT SEDS. So for some of you who are case managers and you're actively involved in the decision-making at your students' plans or at the students' convenings, we've included some snapshots from CT SEDS. So where the green arrow is pointing, it indicates the district and state testing tile in CT SEDS. And so this is available for any student with a documented plan. The team is going to log on to this program card and document the accommodations that are appropriate for grade 11. So you'll also see to the right the list of the accommodation menu for grade 11 SAT. And then for those of you that are planning for science, we also have a similar menu specific for the grade 11 NGSS assessment. Next slide, please. Okay, and I'm just going to have Keisha speak to this because I think this is an important takeaway for your students who are participating on other College Board assessments throughout their secondary education. Keisha?
Thank you, Thanks, Deirdre. Yeah, so I briefly touched on this earlier when gave a preview of the new accommodation that will launch in December, text-to-speech for math, specifically addressing it on the side of the College Board approved accommodation. Always good to remember that College Board approved accommodations result in a college reportable score. And so we will talk a little later more about your previously approved students, but it's just important to know because we do often find this as a common question. Do I need to go back in and request for the student who was previously approved? And the answer is no. When a student has been previously approved, you are not going back into the SSD online system to request for those accommodations again. Those accommodations will remain active for that student. So again, going back to what I said, when it's College Board approved accommodation, those accommodations can also be used for other assessments. But because you're, in most cases, probably going to initiate an accommodation for at least a few of your students the first time, it's always helpful to remember that you should be referring back to that student's active plan, as Deirdre just covered, through the CT SETS system. We are reiterating a couple of times, not to just be repetitive, but to keep that date in your head, that January 12th of 26 will be the SSD deadline. That's the targeted date you want to meet for the majority of your students. We understand there will be some exceptions, and we can care for those as they come in after, but primarily focusing on January 12th. The added benefit of the College Board approved accommodation for your students, not only are they able to use those accommodations for other College Board assessments, those accommodations remain active throughout that student's high school career, plus one additional year post-graduation. We spoke a little bit about the EL, ML learner supports that will be available in SSD online. But again, just wanting to reiterate that that eligibility will be based on the student's information identified under their EL, ML status in PSIS. We currently today, for those who are actively identified as SSD users, you can see that the selection today is still available for what was already being offered prior to the upcoming changes, but up to time and 1/2, that will remain in place. This will allow that student to test in the same room with extended time and a half testers. So your other kids who are receiving 50% identified as a College Board approved accommodation, you can test those students in the same room with your EL 50%. They're on the same, receiving the same amount of time. Of course, the up to means that the timing is flexible for those students after they meet the standard amount of time, which is required for all testers, not just accommodated students, whether College Board approved or EL, but it applies for non-standard students as well in terms of meeting the standard time requirement. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I just wanted to call that out. And then, as I did cover before, launching in December will be the embedded text-to-speech for the math sections. So that will be available for your kids, assuming you meet the requirements, as Deirdre had also touched on as well, in preparation for CT School Day. And they will receive a College Board reportable score. So there are additional EL, ML language supports that we offer for participation in the SAT suites, as I did cover earlier. These two do not require entry into SSD online, so there's no formal approval that needs to be entered in order for it to be included for test day. They are non-embedded. These are or they are translated test directions. We are currently now offering 2 additional languages for the upcoming school year. If for any reason, if any language that your students speak are not included in this list for translated test directions, you can actually also support your student by having a locally provided translator to create the translations in the student's language if it is not already inclusive to what we have displayed here. And each year, from what I have witnessed, we continue to add additional languages. But for now, this is what we currently offer that's already through the translated test directions process for our EL students. But again, if the language is not available, just be rest assured that you can also provide it via a locally provided translator. And then the other support is the word-to-word bilingual dictionaries. There's a full list of the dictionaries that can be directly found through the hyperlink on the College Board website. Those will be available for download starting in February. So very briefly here, and I will probably call on Deirdre to just come off mic for a moment if she wants to speak to this, is the Connecticut SAT School Day Crosswalk. This was actually designed to help our educators understand the relationship between a College Board approved accommodation that's directly in SSD online, comparing it to Connecticut SAT accommodations identified on the IEP or 504. Deirdre, would you mind?
Great, thank you. So thanks, Keisha. We're going to just walk you through some of the resources we have updated for this upcoming school year that specifically pertain to the Connecticut SAT School Day. So the crosswalk that you see on the slide does provide a breakout of the accommodations listed in CT sets, along with the supplemental or companion accommodation in SSD Online. And then we also include some notes and takeaways, some considerations as far as how the accommodation works in the context of online testing. And we provide some clarification for the accommodation. So when the teams are determining whether a student needs text-to-speech versus a screen reader, you can use this document to help delineate the accommodations and understand the functionality and purpose for each. So we recommend that you use this document when the teams are convening. As a reminder, the accommodation menu in CT SEDS as well as in SSD Online isn't something that should just be, the accommodation shouldn't just be selected because they're available. We really want to ensure that students are having the identified barriers removed from the test setting based on what their documented need is. And so sometimes by choosing an accommodation that the educational team thinks the student might benefit from actually could introduce a barrier. So please use this resource to help with the determination process. Next slide. Okay.
Thank
We
you,
also
Deirdre.
just, yep, go ahead, Keisha, and I'll jump in after. Thanks.
Oh, perfect. So we continuing the theme of what Deirdre had pointed out in the previous slide in terms of when you're looking at the information for your student in terms of the College Board approved accommodation, comparing it to the information in CT SEDS and having conversations about accommodations for students. Know that these students are taking a digital test. And so with the digital test, we actually are able to offer you students to, Deirdre, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're cutting out.
Okay, sorry about that. So this will allow students to receive universal tools, all testers, accommodated and non-accommodated, without formally requesting in the College Board SSD Online system. So there are some things to think about. And one great example here would be, you may have a student that typically may have been identified with large print, but for digital, students can actually utilize the magnification feature or zoom in feature, which is a universal tool. So Deirdre actually assisted with creating this great slide and gave a comparison of some of the various universal tools that we offer. And so in addition to some additional resources that will be included with this content as well. So those are things to just think about in terms of a color contrast. That would be another example. So this will allow the student through the configuration on the testing device to adjust the color to their liking. We do still offer color contrast as a College Board approved accommodation, but that's when you would have the individual colored overlay sheet that is needed to put over the screen. So those are things to think about. It's always first trying to see if the students can utilize those universal tools where needed. Of course, there are other things that must be always requested as a College Board approved accommodation, but some of these with the digital platform are suffice for students. So think about the tools first, and then also of course, accommodations that would be needed for a student, such as an example, extended time. If a request for an accommodation is needed, we ask that you just, target certain questions before you begin the request, making sure that you do have the consent for requesting the accommodations for the student, and that would be needed for the IEP or 504. It is further confirming that the parent and educator have had that conversation, and the parent understands that they will, if their student was not already approved for College Board accommodations, that they will receive notification about their student receiving College Board approved accommodations. And the consent is kept on file at your school. You can utilize the College Board consent form, or we also accept as alternate consent the signed IEP or 504. Deirdre, is there anything that you wanted to say about consent?
Thank you so much. I would just reiterate that for the purposes of the Connecticut SAT school day, the consent is essentially synonymous with the implemented IEP Section 504 plan. So that essentially gives consent for accommodations on SAT for the state accountability assessment. Thanks, Keisha.
Thanks, Deirdre. It's also important just to have, before you begin the SSD online entry process, to have the student's demographic information in front of you. If the student was previously approved, but previously approved at a different school, that's considered a transfer. So you would need the student's SSD DID number. If this is a brand new school, a student fresh, did not have any previous history of having College Board approved accommodations, you will need to have all of the students' information in terms of how not just their demographic information, but information about the plan before you begin entering, because there will be multiple questions that will come up in this process for entering the students. And when you have it in front of you, it does make it a much more seamless process. Typically, when entering requests, especially if you're brand new, you will need maybe up to 10 minutes in order to get comfortable with submitting the request. And we'll talk about that a little later. But again, it is about preparing and making sure you have the appropriate information. You've looked at CT SEDS, as Deirdre mentioned before. You have this information. You're looking at the crosswalk to make sure that the accommodations that you're asking is in line as much as possible. But we are also here to support you throughout the process. So your outreach to Deirdre, Deirdre and I, again, work regularly together. We will assist anyone who is less familiar with the SSD online system, but making sure that you are fully prepared in order to meet the January 12th deadline.
And Keisha, if I can just jump in, I did include a link to the College Board's practice with accommodations in Blue Book, and I can't reiterate enough how useful this resource is, especially if teams are trying to delineate between certain accommodations that are comparable. So if, for instance, if you're working with a student with a visual impairment and you're trying to delineate whether the Zoom features are suffice or if the student's going to require a higher level accommodation, then try out the embedded supports in Blue Book on a practice test. And then, and I'm not suggesting a full-length practice test, but just try out the shortened test. And then you can go ahead, try out the universal features, and then determine if, again, higher level supports are needed. And the same is true for text-to-speech. For kids who use text-to-speech regularly and need it because of a visual or print disability, try it out on the practice test and make sure that it meets the student's needs. If it's a distraction, if the student finds that the way the accommodation is provided is distracting, then that's useful information to determine if the student's needs can be met using a different accommodation. That might come in the form of screen reader if the student uses screen reader regularly. Maybe it comes in the form of a human reader. I'm not sure. Again, it's really based on the student's individualized profile, but the practice test is a great resource to try out some of these features with your students to make sure they have the perfect fit.
Thanks, Deirdre. Okay. Moving forward, we're just talking very briefly here because we do have a lot of slides and I want to stay on time as much as possible about testing with assistive technology. So the Blue Book platform provides and permits a range of assistive technology options. You will need to, when dealing with assistive technology, if it requires configuration, you have to make sure that you are following the information as it aligns to your operating system's installment instructions. So many schools may utilize Chromebook, but we also have some schools who utilize Windows, iPads, or Macs. And so this information is extremely important to follow in order to make sure that your systems are prepared to operate and function properly for test day. We did cover about universal accessibility features. Those are actually built directly into the Blue Book platform without any additional configuration. Embedded additional accessibility tools are also available directly in Blue Book to a student's corresponding approved accommodation. And then for external assistive devices or assistive technology, this does require where we say non-embedded, such as a screen reader, because the third-party screen reader software has to be configured onto the Blue Book test platform in order for the student to utilize that accommodation on test day. So there are some circumstances before we go into all things about SSD Online, but there are circumstances where you do not actually have to require an accommodation. And so again, we did talk about the universal tools, but then there are also certain types of accommodations that may be appropriate for the student to participate in other College Board assessments, but for the purpose of the SAT school day and school testing, you do not have to do that. And I have a few of those covered here. Small group, I will not stay on that too long, but just as a general rule, normally a small group for a standard size class is 10 students, because this will also, you need to follow the College Board seating policy as well. Preferential seating, if the student needs to sit in the front or the back, if that is the only thing that is being requested, they do not require any additional time or any other supports, such as additional breaks or anything. If it's only as a standalone, and that applies for small group as well, you can just go ahead and support your student with that. Students that require wheelchair accessibility or any type of special furniture, such as a slanted desk, you can go ahead and do that. If your students require access to a nurse or the nurse's aide office during the actual designated break, you can allow that. A familiar proctor, you have to be mindful because we want to make sure that there is no conflict of interest. So a parent should not be proctoring in the same room as their child. If you have other questions about that, I would recommend speaking with Deirdre and or Michelle separately offline of this today's session. If a student chooses to take SAT weekend, as I mentioned, other College Board assessments, those are the same accommodations that I said, oh, you don't have to request for a CT school day. You would need to request it for the weekend assessment. So it's just thinking about these things. And this may only apply to a very small number of your students, but it's still important. And then, of course, as we covered before, the word-to-word and EL translated test directions, that does not require any formal request in the system. So you will have the majority of your students go through what we refer to as school verification, and that simply means no documentation is required. However, for a very small handful of your students, you may be required to, you may be asked in the submission process to formally submit documentation. For Connecticut SAT school day, under the contract, when documentation is requested for most, and I'll talk about why we cannot say for all in a moment, for most students, If documentation is required, you would just simply need to go to the CSDE's intranet to their resources page for SAT School Day, and you can download and print off the Connecticut SAT School Day upload request form that is here. For most of your kids, when you have this type of scenario, and so an example of where this would be accepted is if you have a diabetic student, you're requesting for the use of the student to test with their permission for their continuous glucose monitor, or for the use of a cell phone because the CGM app is on their phone, you would need to submit this form. And this would be acceptable in order for it to continue to be processed. Where it would not be acceptable, and I will touch on it a little later, but I want to just make sure I message it here, is that if you are identifying whether a disability category or the accommodations category as other, that will trigger documentation review. And in those instances, we will require for you to formally submit documentation. It is, again, on a rarity that this should happen because we have a large, extensive list of disability categories to select from, as well as from the accommodations categories. But there are scenarios where you will have to select other. And when you do that, if it's regarding a physical medical disability, you're requesting for a student to test paper, these are things that we need to actually review. Why? Paper testing for most kids would not be needed. This is a digital assessment, and through the various types of accommodations and accessibility that we offer, a lot of your students will be able to take that test digitally and not with paper. Where is the exception with paper? With our Braille students. If you have visually impaired students that cannot test digitally with screen reader or refreshable Braille, and a student prefers to utilize a Braille paper test, you will still need to upload this form just because of how the system is currently set up today. But Braille paper will always be approved. But if you have a kid asking for paper tests because it's the preference, we will actually need to have more information to identify exactly what the issue is, why the student would not be able to test digitally, and also preference alone is not a reason that we would support giving a paper test for a student. So very quickly, we're going to cover commonly requested accommodations. For those of you who are new, this is something you would definitely want to take a look at, and we also have a lot of other resources. And so that's why I also put here in the messaging, we have a SAT Suite Accommodations and Supports Handbook. It's very detailed. It gives a lot of, covers more of the information about our accommodations and also other assessments that we offer at the College Board. Currently, the handbook is identified with this link today. It's for the fall. It is still very similar, but we do a more extensive breakout when we speak to SAT School Day content. So we are actually finalizing our spring 2026 resource for the handbook, and that will be available in early December. So let's talk about extended time, which is one of the most requested accommodations along with text to speech. But very briefly here, for extended time, we do offer variations from up to time and 1/2, which is 50%, up to double time, which is 100, and up to more than. So that's a rare type of accommodation. But we do see scenarios where students, it may be appropriate for a student depending on their disability. It may be a physical medical disability where the student will need to have more than double time. And if so, you should request that, but that will also be identified as an other and require documentation. So Deirdre and I will work with you throughout the process when these types of requests come up. But for your up to time and 1/2, your up to double time, in most cases, these kids are going to go through with no documentation required. And you'll know when documentation will be required for your students because there will be the highlighted messaging when you, depending on what you click on, to indicate to you that documentation is required. So just be mindful of that. I don't say it to scare you, but I'm just pointing out that most of these students will go through that school verification process where you will not, excuse me, I'm tongue-tied right now, you will not be asked to provide documentation. And our up to time in 1/2 and up to double time kids are testing 1 day. It is a much shorter test, even with the additional amount of time that's offered for students. We do ask that you consult the test coordinator manual and proctor guide for the timing tables. But again, mostly all of our students will actually take this exam over 1 day. Limited time testing. This is something, again, it falls under rare because that's going to be identified in the other category. You will be required to provide documentation to us. And this is one of those instances where we will ask, I'll have that conversation with Deirdre and say, hey, this school is asking to test the student over more than 1 day. So we will need to have some information about exactly why the student is unable to test. And it's not just solely based because it's identified on the IEP or 504, but it's that is it something where we know for certain, based on the severity of the condition, that the student would not be able to sit for 1 day? And if that information is there, yes, we will offer it, but it's not something that we just commonly provide for students. Breaks are a very common type of accommodation that we offer. We have different variations. All students taking the SAT school day for grade 11 will actually get a designated break in the middle between the reading, writing modules and before they start the math modules. So that's standard for all students. But when you have scenarios where students require additional breaks, these are the different break options that we have. So your extra breaks will add on a 5-minute break to the module time, and it will be between each section. Your extended breaks are basically doubling the break. So that 5-minute break will become a 10-minute. We have scenarios where students will have a mixture of extra and extended. And then we also have breaks as needed, which many of you, if you're returning SSD coordinators, may already be familiar with. We do offer stop the clock breaks as needed for some students. We commonly see it for our students who have physical medical. So a student who needs to use the restroom frequently would have breaks as needed. The pause button would be on their screen and they would be able to use that. A reasonable break time is typically no more than 10 minutes. Again, students testing 1 day in most cases, so we want to make sure that they are able to complete the exam. Another example, we may have scenarios where you have your diabetic students. Again, they may need to use the restroom frequently. They may need to stop in order to test their blood sugar, and they're unable to do it during the designated break that is built in for all students. So again, it's a wonderful accommodation for those students who need it. Wonderful in the sense that it doesn't allow them to lose any time. They're able to stop that clock and then come back and continue testing. We did cover embedded text-to-speech very briefly when I spoke about the new embedded text-to-speech accommodation for math. But in general, the embedded text-to-speech functionality works as it says. It is embedded into the Blue Book platform when that student is approved. And there are 2 variations for that. So it's text-to-speech embedded for the entire test, which will allow them from start to finish of the exam, as Deirdre and I have both covered throughout today's session. And then with the new oncoming accommodation for text-to-speech embedded for math, which will only enable the student to utilize the text-to-speech functionality for the math sections. Our non-embedded, this is the screen reader. This is that third party, the JAWS as an example, that the JAWS operating system software that I spoke about earlier, this is where screen reader comes into play. And so just like text-to-speech, we offer it for the entire test. And we will also have it as a very rare selection for the math sections. And the reason why I say that is rare is because, again, the screen reader needs to be utilized from start to finish. When a student has a screen reader accommodation, everything will be read to them from the top of the screen where you see that blue bar. It's going to tell them that there's a blue bar. It's going to tell them that those words are put in bold, and then the words are put in blue before it reads each word. So it's very specific, and we'll cover just a side by side of that in one moment. And then speech to text. This is for your students who are unable to actually respond on the keyboard and would need to have third-party enabled software such as Dragon Speak, Naturally Dragon Speaking, actually that's the name, but that must be identified as an accommodation. So the speech to text accommodation in SSD Online is actually referred to as dictation for digital exams. As I mentioned, yep.
Keisha, if I can just jump in real quick,
Sure.
just to verify, there are no open-ended items or essays as part of the Connecticut SAT school day. So again, students shouldn't need speech to text unless they really are dependent on that third-party software for recording their responses. Thanks.
Thank you for adding that, Deirdre. I think that was extremely important to share that. So text-to-speech embedded versus screen reader embedded. I think this is just a really good way to get familiar with it, to understand the difference. Again, I know that quite often the names are interchangeable, but they do have slightly different functionality. Again, for the College Board SAT, for our assessments, this accommodation, text-to-speech, is embedded versus non-embedded screen reader. Text-to-speech is the built-in tool versus the separate application that must be configured through third-party software for screen readers, excuse me. Text-to-speech normally is for our students who have trouble reading. They need the text read. It's helpful for them to follow along with it, and they will also be able to get the short descriptions of the graphics and images. Versus our screen reader students who not only the reading is a challenge for them, but they're unable to see the actual words on the screen. So they need that additional technology to read all of the text and all of the properties on the page, as I had just briefly reviewed. And then it's also giving a very detailed description versus a short description, because they also need the details with the graphics and images. And again, there does require some configuration. Usually our screen readers are also going to receive what I'm going to talk about right now, and that is some additional Braille support. And they typically will need the support of having that Braille supplement in addition to the screen reader. But first, Braille, as I mentioned, for College Board requests for a student that would require Braille paper testing, we will approve that. Today in SSD Online, if you were to go in and request for Braille paper, it must be identified by putting it in the other and specifying Braille paper. If you want to start and do that now, as I have been encouraging folks to start as early as possible because SSD Online is open, you should do that. But I do want to also share something that's happening starting in mid-December. Braille paper will actually have its own selection in SSD Online. And so what does that mean? That means that there are two Braille formats, and that's Braille test materials available in Unified English Braille, which is UEB with Nemeth code for math, or Braille Unified English Braille for math science materials, so that it's supported with UEB for both math and literary text. So for schools that have students with visual impairments that typically use Braille, this is very familiar with you. So again, today, because we haven't made the update yet, you would need to go in and select other and formally type in that you are asking for Braille paper tests and specify the format. However, in mid-December, when we launch these updates, you will now be able to just simply select on which Braille format that you want. Those students will not need to further process as far as submitting any information to us, unless maybe you're also asking for something that would trigger other, as I mentioned, like the more than up to, if if it's more than double time, something like that. That is the only way it would trigger. But if your student needs 50% or 100% along with Braille, with the Braille paper, these will now, after mid-December, start to process via school verification. So I am so excited about this because we would often get feedback about, how do I request for Braille? It doesn't clearly show me, or if you only select Braille because it's a digital test, and we've done a lot of work to make the information clear, to say that Braille by itself automatically, when you select it, translates to the screen reader. But we gave that feedback to our technicians, our tech teams, and said, how can we develop this to make it easier? And so I hope for our students that will need Braille paper format, this will be a much easier process in terms of you're receiving that update within a shorter amount of time, because it will school verify, and of course because it takes the load off of the educator thinking that if for any reason, if they did something wrong or did not ask for it appropriately and it gets closer to test day, this goes away, because it now will just update the information, and this will ensure an automatic shipping of those materials ahead of time. So as long as you're meeting the January 12th deadline, we are able to ensure that we're supporting this for students that may be starting week 1 of testing. Let me jump to number 2, what I mentioned before about the raised line drawings. So you may have a student approved for the screen reader, where the test everything would be read for that student from end to end, but they may also need to, in many cases, students will also need to have the raised line drawing supplement. So this can be requested in addition to, and that raised line drawing supplement, for those of you who do not know, this is actually important for the math content, for the student to have this information. So again, that does not go away with the change, but again, just wanted to call out something really important that was happening for our students requiring Braille paper tests. And then recording answers very briefly. In very rare instances where there are requests for a paper pencil, if a student is approved for this, they can use a manual Braille writer. So that could be something, one of the more common names are the Perkins Braille writer, and it would be applicable for all test sections for the students. There are other types of accommodations, such as auditory amplification for students. It allows them to use headphones for this, and it also will allow for the proctor to wear a microphone, in order to give the instructions for our students. American Sign Language and also Signed Exact English for test directions only. We do offer this, and so you would just need to provide a sign language interpreter in order to to have those spoken instructions signed to the student in either 2 forms of the sign language. Food, drink, and medication, tongue-tied again, will allow our students to bring in food and drink and have that while testing, as well as if they need to take medication during one of their breaks in the testing room, or they can take a designated break in order to either have food, drink, or their medication without waiting for the one break for all students. So typically with this, we also have students who would normally have additional breaks added to ensure that they can stop at other times throughout the test. So that could be breaks as needed. It depends on the individual student, or it could be the extra or extended breaks that I covered earlier. As I mentioned before, permission to test blood sugar. There are certain requests that will always be identified as other, as well as permission for the mobile phone in order to test the blood sugar. Typically, for students who have this accommodation, that phone will need to remain in airplane mode or guided access, and it must remain on the proctor's desk. So, Dominique did mention earlier on about the wave functionality. This is a one-time applicable change that happens through the SDMS system, the State Data Management System. So it is not the same as formally going in to remove an accommodation from SSD online. And for the purpose of participating in the Connecticut SAT School Day, if you know that the accommodations are not changing for this student, but you've had a conversation with them, a student and family, parent or guardian, that, well, you know, 50%. I see my son or daughter has tested with extended time and breaks, and even with the extended time flexibility of the up to not having to use all of it, we think that they will be fine with just having their extra breaks that are identified as their College Board approved accommodation, but we would like to waive the 50%. So yes, you can do that. And again, it would just be the one time, but it goes through a different flow, which would exist in the state data management system. A removal means that the IEP or 504 has been formally changed, and you now want to make that change in SSD Online because you want to formally take away the 50%, that it has been signed off through the meetings with the family that they are no longer needing that particular accommodation. So those are different, right? So it's just targeting the questions that we have here. When is an accommodation waived prior to testing, right? Again, what I've already covered, the student does not want to use the accommodation for this one specific exam. That accommodation will remain a part of their IEP or 504. You are not removing it from SSD Online. You have the consent. Yes, it says the written consent here, but that written consent is applicable to that communication with the family. It's not the formal consent form that I talked about before or the sign off of the IEP or 504. This is just a different level of consent where you're having that conversation and they understand, parent or guardian and student, if student is under 18, understands that it will be waived temporarily just for that one assessment. And keeping that consent waive for the one-time change, keeping that documented at your school. College Board does not need to have that. But again, if you have a question about it, I always say before you do it, refer to CSDE because that is your source for for policies. And if you are confused about the waive or removal, Deirdre would definitely be the person to speak with. And if she needs to connect with me, I'm just an email away, and we are in regular contact throughout the school year in order to support our educators. Again, where is this accommodation waived? That would be in the SDMS management system. And who can waive the student's accommodation for them in SDMS? That would be your SSD coordinator. Deirdre or Michelle, I will just ask you very quickly, is there any other requirement in terms of who can do the waive in SDMS?
The task coordinator and the SSD coordinator. And I did
Okay.
just put something in the chat, so I know we still have a lot of slides to get through, but if you check in the chat, I do have some cautionary guidance about waiving accommodations for Connecticut SAT School Day.
Thank you, Deirdre. So I did briefly mention about students previously approved. As a best practice, I'm not going to stay on this long because we are actually getting closer to the end of our time, but I want to make sure that I say here, today's session, as a reminder, is being recorded. So if anyone is unable to stay on as we go through the last remaining slides, you will have access to this information. For best practices, again, it's all about starting earlier, leaving yourself more time to submit, especially for new requests. And also if you're a new coordinator, just to get your feet wet and become more familiar with the SSD Online system before you begin putting in the information for your students. Making sure that you've had the conversations with the student and family about their expectations. What were the accommodations discussed during the IEP 504 plan meetings? Of course, that information would also need to be identified in the plan. Are they consistent with what the student is utilizing? So with that crosswalk, I think that's a really great tool to use in conjunction with this as well, because the names now, where we used to say, you know, in terms of the terminology, but if the up to time is very similar, in terms of the College Board accommodation, just understand, you know, our definition versus what CT SEDS is, because they are two separate systems. And so it's not just what the student has in CT SEDS, it's also making sure what you're selecting in SSD online aligns more with the time for the student. So your 50% IEP student, that would be your up to 50% in SSD online. And just making sure that the student and their guardians understand those two differences about the assessments, because again, they will receive a letter once the student has been approved for the accommodations. I touched on this earlier about this print dashboard feature, and I can't see the Q&A, but I tried to sneak looking through on my phone to see if I could kind of see a pattern or certain questions that may be coming up. But your print dashboard feature, again, that will allow you to export the file via a CSV file of your students that are associated with your school. Those are the only students that you will be able to see. You're not going to see a student coming from for a different high school such as Greenwich versus Wilton. If you are the SSD coordinator identified at Wilton, you will see only your students associated with Wilton High School who are listed with College Board approved accommodations or EL supports if you're in the EL portal. So just be mindful of that. This will also, again, help you with just connecting with your test coordinator to do a side-by-side comparison of verifying that the accommodations you see listed from the printout also align to what is in TDTK. So trying to do this as early as possible is very important, because you also may have some students, again, already identified, but now maybe there's been a change to the IEP or 504. So if there are no changes necessary, there's no action for you to do for the individual student in SSD Online. If there has been a change to the formal plan, then you would be doing the removal. So we kind of touch on this a little bit in terms of, you know, for this test administration, but Deirdre will also, as she put in the chat, just addressing like the wave functionality, because CSDE wants to make sure that they are being very clear in terms of what their requirements for this. So it's important that we call that out. Of course, if there's a change to the College Board accommodations, if you need to add on something, that is when you're going to go back into the system to make a request for something new, not an accommodation that's already existing on the student's record in SSD Online. Submitting new requests. You will constantly see January 12th listed here because we want to make sure this is drilled in your head about the importance of starting as early as possible. I will not cover this again because I've touched on this several different times in terms of the process to make sure you are working to get the information in and what you need to do with communicating with the family and that IEP or 504 verifying. But I will jump down to just repeat about the other. The disability and accommodation categories have a very full, extensive list for each one. So please make sure that you are carefully reviewing this information to avoid unnecessarily selecting the option for other. Once the request is received into SSD Online, carefully review that information just to make sure it's free of any errors. Sometimes I know when I'm typing fast, I may mistakenly fat finger and, now I have incorrectly submitted something. We want to avoid that as much as possible before you submit. There is a review functionality on that screen, a review feature that will ask you to review the information before you hit the submit button. Once you do that, just check your dashboard regularly, and you will also receive emails confirming that there is a decision for your student. So for someone brand new, you've never been into SSD Online, you haven't started the initial SSD request process, which you will start after today's session. But before that, for today, this is what the initial submission entry process in SSD Online looks like. So once you've established your College Board professional account, you've received confirmation, you've set up your SSD access requests, you've received that confirmation that you're all set, and now you're on to the SSD dashboard. The first thing you're going to see is welcome, to welcome you into the system. When you select the blue button that says new request, you're going to see a pop-up and it will show you the different types of accommodation and or support categories. So the first at the top is our College Board or CB approved accommodations. And the reason why is that these are always going to be college reportable. So we start with that first. And then our English learner support which will come next, those will always be reportable. Ignore that third line. We'll make sure that the information you get will have that blocked out. When you log into SSD Online as a FYI, you will not even see that third option. So we're jumping ahead. Temporary supports. We'll talk about that in one moment. But again, as I mentioned, that's only when a kid has experienced the injury closer to test day. And we'll talk about that shortly. But when you're initially submitting your request, that new request in SSD Online, have you received the permission? We already know you have the permission because as Deirdre covered, it's on the IEP or 504. So you are going to say, yes, you have permission from the parent and or guardian, and that student is under 18 years of age. If the student is 18, do you have that permission based on CSDE's requirement for an 18-year-old student participating in the College Board SAT school day exam? You will next see a pop-up about before you begin. This is where I said having your demographic information on hand, it's just giving you an overview of what you can expect to see throughout the SSD experience of submitting accommodations in the system. When you do that, you're being asked to identify the student. Why? Because sometimes you may think that this student did not have accommodations when in fact it's matching, our systems is matching that there is a student identified under your school with those accommodations. So it's important to do that. So you're simply just doing what is asked here. Again, we're sharing this content, so I won't go into all of these details, but you're putting the student's name in, you're searching and selecting it. When and if the student's name does not appear, you're simply saying, my student is not listed by selecting on that button that's to the bottom left. Once you do that, now you would move forward into putting in the new request for your student. Your demographic information, again, this is why we want to make sure you're taking your time to minimize any errors. You're putting all this information in by adding the student info, name, date of birth, school address information. This is where I said, making sure you do not select other. You're submitting this new accommodation for the student, identifying them based on their disability. So you're going to go through the full list to identify what the student's disability is. In the rare instance, if it's not matched through the information that is in more detail when you're in the live system for the categories, that is the only time you should select other. So now the next screen you'll go to after putting in the disability category will be the accommodations category. Utilizing the example here for extended time, you will then, in most cases, select either 50% or 100%. Again, this will not trigger documentation review, so be mindful of what's being requested. And then, of course, in those very rare instances, you would select the other categories such as the more than, but you will be asked to provide formal documentation for this. As you're going through SSD Online, you will need to save from before moving on to the next screen. This is also making sure that that information is being correctly captured into the system. And you will see this at least more than once or twice throughout the request entry process. I did note here about paper testing. It is a separate, again, accommodation in SSD Online that is other, and it is something that we will rarely support. But if we do, it would be on the basis of having very thorough documentation. So in those instances, when we get these requests, not only am I looking at it before I pass it on for further review, I'm also communicating with Deirdre just to let her know that we're getting a paper request and trying to get some more background information. So proceed with that with caution, because the expectation is that the majority of our students will be able to test digitally. So when you're submitting that new request in SSD Online, we are asking just some simple questions about the school plan. We're just asking that you address that information. If there was a meeting to discuss, in all cases, very likely there was. You're selecting yes. We asked to know who exactly was a part of the meeting. This is really important, more so for when the request has to move forward for additional review. But it is still a standard process. It is also because SSD Online is not just a system specific for CT SAT school day. Because these accommodations, particularly College Board approved accommodations, are being supported for other assessments, we need to have levels of information. So we try to limit it in order to get some information to capture initially. But again, it applies for other assessments, which is why we ask for the additional details. So when you are completing your process in SSD Online towards the final steps, you are reading and consenting to the terms and agreement, that the information you're putting in is accurate. And then once you submit the information, as I had mentioned before, you are regularly checking your SSD dashboard. We're going to just take a brief walk through, which will look slightly similar but less detail specific for our EL, ML supports. These are different from College Board approved accommodations, not just because these are not under an IEP or 504. EL, ML supports must be requested in SSD Online yearly. It is not an accommodation that rolls over throughout the student's high school career plus that one additional post-grad. That is not applicable for EL, ML. It is only specific to the school year. So if you started entering your students for participation in this past October's either it was the PSAT NMSQT or PSAT 8-9, if there are any districts that participated in October, your EL student that you put in the system for October, that rolls over if that is also a grade 11 student participating in the CT SAT school day. So it's very important to remember that. If you had a student who participated maybe under district testing for PSAT 10 last year, which is not part of the contract, that EL ML student, if they are grade 11, and they still require those supports, you will need to put it through the EL portal again for this year. Those supports actually expire at the conclusion of spring school day. Submitting your new EL ML requests in SSD Online. Again, for spring, it will be college reportable, as I mentioned, renewed annually, and those are the two supports that will be available. Up to time and 1/2 extended time is visible through the EL portal today. And then in mid-December, you will be able to see EL embedded text-to-speech for math, and that will be available for spring. As I mentioned earlier, temporary supports. This is at the bottom of the screen for a reason. It is something that is very rare. Rare in the sense that we are going to approve it earlier. We know that injuries happen for our students participating in sports or any other haphazard that could commonly occur, but it would only be requested as you are getting closer to the student testing. So if your student is participating for in the spring, they've suffered an injury such as a broken hand, some type of temporary ailment. They're playing sports. They could have suffered a concussion, and maybe the doctor has identified that staring at the screen for a certain amount of time causes headaches. They're now asking for breaks as needed for that student to use the pause button and stop frequently. This is where the temporary support would live. So there is documentation required, usually just like the medical information would be appropriate. We do have a actual detailed process when you select the temporary support portal. We do say that typically requests within 14 days may not be supported. And let me clarify that. What that simply means is if you're asking for you're scheduled to start the first week and you've just submitted to us 14 days or less this particular request, while we will try to support this reviewing this temporary request in order to honor the student with some type of temporary accommodation, what we typically will advise is that we need time to review it, but we will also ask that you plan to test the student later in your testing window. So just being mindful that we will be there to support these students throughout the school day testing window. But when you have these type of, accidents that just happen and student was scheduled to test starting on Monday, that while College Board may not be prepared to respond to the request in enough time to support the temporary condition, we will support the temporary condition so that the student has a decision and should be able to test, assuming we did approve it. In most cases, we will, but they will just need to test later in the window. Deirdre, are you still hearing me?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Okay, so what I mentioned before about paper testing accommodations. So yes, it is rare, excluding our Braille paper testers. But how do I go in to request? I at least want to show you this so that you understand how it will work. So when you are in SSD Online, when you're selecting the accommodation, you're selecting the accommodation category, you will go down to Other and then type in paper test for digital assessments. This will still require documentation, but we try to go back to these cases and say, what exactly is needed here, right? The paper test is a longer test compared to the digital exam. The paper version of the SAT is not adaptive. And so the digital testing experience will be better for most of your students, right? We're not talking about the scenarios where a student cannot test digitally and needs Braille paper. We're saying, what exactly is the reason here? So we need to have information about the disability and also the accommodations. If any other accommodations are being requested, that's going to be through the formal documentation based on that disability, because I need to forward this over to our clinical team, such as Dr. Sasha Pimienta, who's joining us on today's call. They need to review these types of requests. So the more information that we have to better understand, it allows us to get to that case sooner and review it thoroughly and make the determination of what we are able to offer. We are not guaranteeing that we can support it, but we can only guarantee a thorough review when you provide sufficient documentation. These are cases also that I will connect with Deirdre on directly. So it would be a follow-up communication from Deirdre to your school so that we can understand what's going on. And if I see something is unclear in the documentation, I still follow up with Deirdre to see if other information can be supported. Again, I don't want to stay on it to try to encourage folks to use it because the preference is for students to test digitally. And we walk through the different types of digital accommodations that are available. We also have hybrid. You heard Deirdre mention human reader. If a student for some reason is unable to test digitally utilizing the text-to-speech accommodation, if that does not work, where the test would be read aloud to them digitally with headphones for all students, but if that does not support it, then we try to figure out, okay, how can we make sure that the student still has some of the digital experience in some way? And so human reader, we do have a human reader for digital test accommodation, which is a hybrid. It allows the student to read the test on the computer, to follow along and respond to their answers on the computer, but they have an actual human reader in the room with them in a one-to-one setting with the script. So I point that out because there are some exceptions where full digital, may not be enough for the student, and we try to figure out how we can do it. But I assure you that majority of your students will be able to test digitally in the spring. This is just another example of the step-by-step with the paper request. So in some rare instance, what do I do if my accommodation request is not approved? Again, first and foremost, the takeaway today is that the majority of your students will be approved. The majority of your students will be approved through no doc review. In those instances where we've had to review a request and formally have documentation because it was identified as other, as the example, first and foremost, review that letter to see what the decision is, right? It could just be a simple case of missing documentation. For Spring School Day, we do more support. So in most cases, I have already reached out to Deirdre. Deirdre has already followed up with you so that we can try to determine what's going on. So it's really no surprise. But it's important that we still touch on this because it may happen in some rare instance, right? You're then gathering the recommended documentation to go ahead and resubmit. So this is more so, I would say, sometimes when there are other assessments that you're looking to request accommodations for. And I've seen that happen, right? Students participating in CT, SAT School Day, but also participating in May for AP. So that could be a part of it as well. And we may need some other information there. But if the documentation does not match what is requested in terms of the disability or the accommodation, that may be a reason why we're not supporting it. But again, the easiest way to always understand why the decision was made to not support something is to review the letter. We have a great team of clinical experts that review documentation and for the formal documentation requirements. So when they respond in the letters, they are telling you exactly when information is not being provided as far as what's missing in order to further determine how we can support. So we've covered a lot of content today, but it is very important that we also drive the message of the training and resources that we do have available. I'm going to stop here and I will allow Dominique to step in.
All right, training and resources. So we do have some SSD online training available. We have them linked here. It's the SSD coordinator training and introduction to administering accommodations. These are online modules. You can go at your own pace. Not a requirement, but we do recommend if you are new that you consider checking out these training resources.
And I will chime in very quickly to say this particular image right here, it's actually, there are some new updates that are coming when you go into SSD Online, into the hyperlinks. There will be more self-serve tools that will be there to walk you through step by step, such as when you want to understand more about the how do I transfer a student. So I had a student who previously approved who attended Greenwich High School with College Board approved accommodations, and now they're my student at Wilton High School. The How Do I Transfer is very easy to help you with understanding that process. And it's a very quick same-day process to do the transfer functionality as well. And we will also add some additional info such as how to remove. But again, that how to remove would only be on the basis of when that IEP or 504 has changed. So just look out over the next couple of weeks as we enter into that mid-December period for some additional enhancements coming your way in SSD Online. Dominique?
All right, there is additional training that we have, training modules that come out in January. They are for all coordinators, all test staff, technology coordinators, school test coordinators, and proctors. The SSD coordinator training is optional, of course, always recommended. As a SSD coordinator, you can go in and choose between the test coordinator training or the proctor training. Just keep in mind, if you are assigned a test day role, then the training is required based on the role that you are assigned to. All right, and digital practice in Blue Book. We did cover practice. I won't spend a lot of time on this. There is a test preview available. The accommodations are not available in the test preview, but to test out the accommodations, you'd want to take the full length practice test. We do recommend, of course, that students get in there and start practicing ahead of time, especially your students who need accommodations. But we also recommend that staff take a look at the accommodations that are available just to familiarize yourself and be able to connect with the student and make decisions based on your experience with the accommodation as well. All right, and these are just some of the accommodations that are available in practice. My practice, so after completing the full length practice test, students can sign into My Practice. It is linked here to view their results. They can view practice score results and practice exam questions, answers, and explanations. Again, won't spend too much time on this since we are already over time, but just know that it is available. We have resources on the Connecticut School Day website that is also linked here. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the related resources. So there are some digital testing resources, resources for special population, and reporting resources. And here I'll kick it to Deirdre for the accessibility chart.
Thanks. I'll just briefly orient you to this resource that we have available. It gives our users a high-level overview of the range of accessibility supports we have for the Connecticut SAT School Day. I encourage you to reference the CSDE assessment guidelines, as well as the College Board SAT Suite website for specific information about how each of these supports function in the context of state testing and College Board policies. And we are so over time, so I'm going to thank you for your time and participation in this presentation. We hope that you found it productive, that many of your questions were answered. You know where to find us if you still have questions, things that you want to know about the SAT. There are slides at the end of the slide deck that pertain to the Connect